'Tis the damn season for a Christmas miracle. Chapter 3. By the time they return to Stark Cabin, Peter knows he's on the verge of a sensory overload. The lights had been amazing, but also overstimulating, and Morgan had talked his ear off the entire drive home, even once he'd fallen silent, trying to focus on the darkness outside his window so he doesn't freak out. When Morgan shrieks, "Can we watch another Christmas movie?" Peter isn't able to hold back his flinch. Morgan doesn't seem to notice, but he thinks Mrs. Stark does. "No can do, little miss. It's already way past bedtime." "Can Petey read me my bedtime story?" Peter wants to. He really does. He owes Morgan so much. If not for her, he might still be sitting teary-eyed and frozen in that graveyard. Instead, he's warm and fed with two whole people who somehow know his name and remember him. He doesn't know what the future will hold, but his outlook is certainly better than it was this morning. May and Ben used to read him stories. He'd love to do that for Morgan, turn the pages and make all the funny voices, and he really doesn't want to disappoint her. Not on Christmas. Not ever. But he knows how he gets when his senses are like this. One loud noise can set him off, one delighted shriek. Even if she tries to climb into his lap, it might do it. He used to have a better handle on this, but now he's not eating or sleeping enough. He's got more triggers and less control. It doesn't take much to send him into an all-out fit. He doesn't want her to see him like that. Doesn't want any of the Starks to see him like that, but especially not Morgan. She won't understand. He doesn't want to scare her or make her think that this is her fault. He's still trying to figure out how to politely decline when his stomach rumbles, mortifyingly loud. Morgan, bless her, giggles. Peter's face flames, and he shifts slightly so he can't catch even a glimpse of Mr. Stark's expression. "Sweetie, how about Peter reads to you another night?" Mrs. Stark suggests. "Sounds like he's hungry. You don't want to make him wait to eat, do you?" "No," Morgan says, though she pouts at her mother before turning to Peter. "Do you promise to read to me tomorrow night?" Peter would make that promise in a heartbeat if it was up to him, but he has no idea how long he'll be staying. He could wear out his welcome at any time. But Mrs. Stark seems to be the boss around here, and if she's telling Morgan that Peter will be around at least long enough to read to her, he doesn't think she'll kick him out until after he does. Peter kneels down so he's eye level with the little girl. "I promise, Morgan," he says solemnly. "All right," she says. "Eat a piece of pie for me, please." "You got it." Then she's running at him, and Peter opens his arms just in time to hug her properly. "Thanks, Mo," he whispers into her hair, "for coming to find me." "Family always finds each other," she says, as if it's a universal law, as indisputable as gravity. "Thanks for making this the best Christmas ever. I love you." Peter feels tears prick at his eyes. "Love you too," he says, overwhelmed by how much he means it. Eventually they disentangle. Mr. Stark takes Morgan up to bed, and Mrs. Stark offers to fix Peter a plate. "You really don't have to do that," he says as he follows her into the kitchen. He thinks she is probably the MVP of the Stark family, the way she'd managed Morgan. "I can do it." "Nonsense, you're a guest." Mrs. Stark opens the refrigerator and starts laying out containers of leftovers on the end of the island she'd instructed Peter to sit behind. He knows it's probably a bad idea to get his stomach used to extra meals that won't continue once he's back on his own, but the thought of filling his stomach with something delicious instead of going to bed hungry is so enticing that he just doesn't care. "I guessed you weren't expecting. I'm sorry I crashed your Christmas." Mrs. Stark paused long enough to arch one perfectly shaped eyebrow. "Knowing my husband and daughter the way I do, I'm fairly certain they crashed your Christmas." Peter chuckles, feeling surprisingly at ease. He'd encountered Miss Potts many times, back in his intern days, but they'd never spent much time together, and never alone. This should be weird now that she knows nothing about him, and he's been suddenly inserted into her life on Christmas of all days. But it's not any weirder than anything else about today. She asks him to take what he wants, allowing him to choose the portions without drawing attention to the earlier food debacle, and he's grateful all over again. When she sticks his plate in the microwave, she cuts herself a hearty slice of pumpkin pie and adds a neat dollop of whipped cream. "This is amazing," he tells her after a few bites. His senses are already settling, the food and relative quiet of the room helping him regulate. Thank you, Peter. I mean it. I didn't know the great Pepper Potts could cook. Pepper Stark, I mean. Sorry, I'm not used to that. It's all right. I still go by Pepper Potts at work. Tony just gets a bit possessive. I'm sure you've noticed. Yeah. Sometime during the years they'd known each other, Peter had gone from the kid to my kid, from the spiderling to my spiderling. Peter had known that it was just Mr. Stark taking credit for someone he'd poured so much time, money, and mentoring into, but he'd been thrilled each time he heard it nevertheless. Tony actually does most of the cooking since I'm so busy with SI. He taught himself shortly after we moved out here, since takeout options are pretty limited. Tony's always been able to learn anything he puts his mind to. He's quite good, but he does have a tendency to get distracted, or a little too creative. We both decided that for the holidays it's best if I take point on food, and he takes point on wrangling Morgan. In the lab, Peter watches that creativity lead to mind-blowing discoveries, and sometimes discoveries that just blow up. That makes sense. So, you're Tony's son, right? Peter accidentally inhales the mouthful of sweet potato casserole he's chewing, and then proceeds to try and choke it back up. Mrs. Stark shoots up with surprising calm and crosses around the island, laying a hand on his shoulder. Are you all right, sweetheart? Do you need the Heimlich? Peter's traitorous, convulsing body leans into her touch, because it's so gentle, so much like May. He knows he should pull away. Instead, he focuses on not dying. No, he wheezes. I'm all right. And after another hacking cough or two, he is. Mrs. Stark removes her hand so she can push his glass of water towards him. He takes a careful sip, mourning how cold the room suddenly seems. Once Mrs. Stark is convinced he can breathe again, she settles back on her stool on the other side of the island. Mr. Stark isn't my father, he says, surprised by how hoarse his voice sounds. The eyebrow raises again, and then Mrs. Stark smiles at him. I've known Tony for a long time, long before we were ever romantically involved. I know he used to be a playboy. You don't have to shield me from anything. The truth won't make me look at you, or him, any differently. But I'm not his son, he stammers. I'm not. Mrs. Stark comes. All right, how do you know him? Because I've never known Tony to hang out with many teenagers. Peter's known an interrogation is inevitable. It's only strange that it's taken this long for someone to ask him any questions. But he feels sweat beading at the back of his neck. Somehow he thinks Mr. Stark's questions might be easier than this one. I was his intern. Tony's never had interns. He doesn't have the patience to wait for someone to catch up to him. He certainly wouldn't take on a high school intern. It started out as an informal thing. I would just help him in his lab sometimes, but it began taking up more and more time, and my aunt wanted it on record for my school, so... He trails off, then works up the courage to look her in the face. So he got you to do all the paperwork. That bit sounds like Tony, but Tony doesn't let anyone into his lab. He doesn't even like me to step in there. He and Bruce worked together once, and a murderous robot almost took over the world. I don't understand why he would let a child that wasn't his own anywhere near his precious projects. What did you work on specifically? Whatever he was working on at the time, but mostly his suits. And, mine. Panic strikes hard, like there's a bad guy standing on his chest, ready to kick him in the face. As much as he'd worried before about people finding out his identity, now it's 1,000 times worse, because he actually knows how bad that can be. But Mr. Stark's wife isn't people. Married couples aren't supposed to keep secrets from one another. May and Ben had taught him that, and if he's going to be a part of Mr. Stark and Morgan's lives, even just a tiny occasional part, then Mrs. Stark is going to want to know why. Surely she'll be there whenever this Boxing Day rolls around with questions of her own, and she's going to hear the truth. Might as well rip off this band-aid now. I'm Spider-Man. Mrs. Stark looks up and down with narrowed eyes. You're so young. I'm almost 18. He crosses his arms and tries to look imposing. Every time he's caught a glimpse of himself in a mirror since the spell, he thinks he looks older. He's pretty sure he's convinced a lot of potential employers that he's a legal adult. It's just once they ask for an ID he doesn't have that they turn him away. But Spider-Man's been active for a long time. Mr. Stark was looking out for me. Now that sounds like Tony. Her posture softens. Peter tries to relax too. I'm sorry about the drones. In London, Edith. That was a mess, and I know you had to deal with it. Edith was Tony's mess. He shouldn't have given that much firepower and responsibility to a child. I'm not a child. But you should be. Something in her tone makes Peter just stop. It's not pity. It's kinder than that. She has no reason to be so kind to him. It's better than he deserves. Look, I'm clearly missing a lot of the story here, but what I do know is that Tony and Morgan have both been out of sorts for weeks, maybe months. I think that's because they were missing you. Tony doesn't trust easily. There's very few people he lets get close to him, and there's arguably nowhere closer than his workshop. That's always been the birthplace of his genius and the outlet for his pain. If he trusts you enough to let you be a part of that, and to get close to his daughter, then it doesn't matter what your story is. You'll always be welcome here. A few tears fall, although Peter manages to swallow the sob that threatens to mortify him in front of this absolute boss. Thank you. Mrs. Stark reaches out and grabs his shoulder, rubbing at the tension there for a few seconds before she gets up and heads back to the fridge. How about a piece of pie? She calls over her shoulder. He eats 2 pieces of pie, 1 piece for him and 1 for Morgan, as promised, leaving him full but not uncomfortably so. It's amazing how the food fixes so many problems he's been having, allowing him to think clearer and more rationally, because he's not dizzy and distracted. He could get used to this. He shouldn't, though. Except maybe he can, he thinks as he stares at the Starks' Christmas tree, which they have nothing on the holiday display they'd visited, but is otherwise the largest tree he's seen out of Rockefeller Centre. After he's finished the pie, Mrs. Stark had offered to send Tony to Peter's room once he was finished with Morgan, but Peter had preferred to wait for him in the living room. He likes the sharp, brisk scent of pine, which had once sent him to the hospital back when he could barely smell it. He likes the softly glowing lights, the classy decorations Mrs. Stark had clearly chosen, side by side with Morgan and Mr. Stark's chaotic additions. He likes that he'll hear Mr. Stark leave Morgan's room, so he'll know for sure if the man decides to go to bed without seeking Peter out. Mr. Stark had been so horrified that Peter wasn't eating enough. He'd always been concerned about Peter's physical needs, his caloric intake, his thermoregulation issues, anything that depressed his healing factor or put him in additional danger. Peter doesn't think Mr. Stark will let him be hungry anymore. When he finds out that Peter can't find enough under-the-table work that isn't immoral to feed himself properly and keep himself off the streets, maybe he'll give him a debit card he can use for food or sign him up for a meal service or something. Peter lets himself imagine what it would be like to eat well again. If he didn't have to spend every extra penny on food, then once his rent was paid, maybe he could buy what he needed to fix the water heater or the lock on his front door. His landlord had made it clear that Peter was taking the apartment as is, with no complaints, or he'd report that the social security number Peter had put on his application was invalid. But Peter could fix these things himself if he had the funds. There was also the pile of tech waiting for him in the spare bedroom. If he sold the laptop and the Stark pad, after he'd scrubbed them of anything extra Mr. Stark had loaded onto them, of course, he could make rent for a couple of months without having to go begging to Jameson with selfies and fuel the anti-Spider-Man sentiment that left him broken-hearted every time someone he saved cursed him out for killing Mysterio. Or he could make enough webs for a whole year not have to worry about affording the chemicals. The new phone would be helpful, but he could pawn that too if he had to. And the autographed Lego set. Well, that money would do him a lot of good, but it hurts to think about selling that, when Mr. Stark had clearly gone to so much trouble. Surely it wasn't wrong for Peter to keep something for himself. Mightn't he be allowed one tiny bit of sentiment to remember what he might have had? Looks like you're swimming in some pretty deep thoughts. Peter flinches and looks up to find Mr. Stark almost within reach. So much for standing guard. He hadn't heard the man come downstairs at all. He clears his throat. Yeah. Sorry that took so long. Little Miss was a little keyed up. Demanded 5 stories before she fell asleep. Peter sits diagonally on the middle of one of the oversized couches, with a recliner nearby and plenty of other seating in the immediate area. A test, he admits to himself, as Mr. Stark assesses the situation and drops down on the end of the same couch, positioning his knees so they are just an inch or 2 from Peter's. I'm sorry I got her all worked up. Maybe if I'd read to her. None of that. Mr. Stark stretches out his leg and nudges it gently against Peter's. She can be a lot, even if you're used to it, which you aren't. It's okay that you needed a break. Peter nudges back and leaves their knees touching. Thanks. This is nothing, kid, he sighs, and all his levity melts away in a single laboured breath. I'm so sorry about May. I know we're keeping it light today, but I had to say it. I'm so damned sorry. Peter can't say that it's okay, because it's not, so he just shrugs, fighting the tears that threaten to fall. Mr. Stark presses more of their legs together, and shifts a little closer on the couch. When's Boxing Day? Peter finally manages to whisper. Excuse me? You keep saying we'll talk about what happened to me on Boxing Day, but I don't know when that is. Oh, right. Forgot everyone didn't grow up with a British butler. Boxing Day's tomorrow, Rue, December 26th. Peter can't decide if that's a good thing or a bad thing. He doesn't want to put this off any longer, really. The dread in his chest is weighing him down. He's glad he won't have to live with that much longer. But once the Starks know the truth of all he's done, that can't be undone. They won't forget again. Once they know that he's a failure who got his last living relative killed, they probably won't be so keen on letting him anywhere near their daughter. The mess Peter's in is entirely of his own making. He should be able to get himself out of it on his own. They'll see that in an instant. I know we're waiting on the big reveal, Mr. Stark said softly, but can you answer one question, just so I can sleep tonight? Peter nods. He's not in a position to deny Mr. Stark anything. He wouldn't, even if he could. I know me and Pep forgot you somehow. Happy too. Tell me we were the only ones, that there was someone beside Morgan who knew who you were. But Peter can't do that. He shakes his head. There had to be someone. Ted, your scary girlfriend. Peter shakes his head. Again. Everyone was supposed to forget. I don't know why Morgan didn't. Christ, Pete. Fuck. Mr. Stark's voice sounded tortured. He's clenching his fist so tightly that Peter hears the hinges in his prosthetic protest. And Peter doesn't want him to be sad. Can't bear it. This isn't Mr. Stark's fault. He shrugs again, trying his best to sound flippant. At least CPS didn't know to come looking for me. They should have come looking for you, Mr. Stark roars, leaping to his feet. Peter presses himself back into the sofa, thinking he might need to make a leap for the ceiling. He can't believe he miscalculated this so badly. Oh my god, please, Mr. Stark, don't call them. Please don't call them. I'll be fine on my own. I'm almost 18. I'm fine. He'd been so young the last time. That awful week between his parents' deaths and May and Ben's miraculous rescue is now mostly just a haze of sadness and strangers and harsh words and unwanted touches, and the soul-crushing knowledge that this was his life now, an unwanted burden at the mercy of an uncaring system. Then May and Ben had saved him, given him 11 wondrous years, and paid for them with their own lives. You're literally starving. How is that fine? I can't go back there. I can't. I won't be able to be Spider-Man. I need to be Spider-Man. It's all I have left. They'll stop me, or they'll find out, or they'll hurt me. I can't. Please don't make me. I'd rather starve. He has to get out of here. He can't stay. He can't. He can't. He can't. He can't breathe. Then Mr. Stark grabs his arm, and Peter flinches away so hard he nearly tips over. And Mr. Stark looks like Peter had hit him. It's enough to make Peter freeze, come what may, and search him flailing mind. He hadn't touched Mr. Stark, had he? Hadn't accidentally punched him in the face? Rue, oh God, I'm sorry, I'm not going to hurt you. You have to know I would never hurt you. Don't call them, Peter whimpers. His broken heart feels like it might burst. Is he dying? Please don't call them. I'll go. You won't get in trouble. I don't even exist. I'm not calling anyone, promise. But you have to breathe, Bambino. You're having a panic attack. No, I'm not. Speaking from personal experience, I'm pretty damn sure you are. I'm gonna reach for your hand, okay? Is it okay if I touch you? Please, he begs. Pathetic, but he doesn't want to die alone. Good boy. Mr. Stark grabs one of his hands and holds it against his chest, right where the reactor used to be. His hand is warm, but it's shaking. Feel my chest rise and fall and breathe with me, all right? In and out. In and out. You can do this. He tries, but he's feeling lightheaded now, like it's been 2 days with only a few bites of food. He thought he didn't have to feel this way anymore. Why can't he ever catch a break? I can't. You can do anything, Peter. I know it. In and out. Follow me. Forget about everything else. It's just you and me. I believe in you. Always have. He sucks in a breath and it reaches his lungs. Tries another. It shudders through him. Good. Good. You got this, champ. In and out. Mr. Stark's hand is no longer shaking. You're safe here, Peter. I promise. You're always safe with me. Peter wishes that were true, but Mr. Stark has never wanted Peter to die in his presence. That's all that is. But he closes his eyes and lets himself pretend. I'm okay, he says sometime later, after the room's no longer spinning and his chest is only as tight as it always is now, just the usual amount of self-loathing and dread. Peter figures that's Mr. Stark's cue to let go, to make the call that will get this pathetic creature out of his house. Peter will never get to read Morgan that story after all. He never should have made that promise. He's too tired to fight whatever comes next. Let CPS come. It's less than a year until he turns 18. He'll survive. Or he won't. Maybe that will be better. Pete, Mr. Stark says, and he still sounds agonised. He's still holding both of Peter's hands. How could you think I would ever turn you over to strangers? Have I really fucked up this badly? You said CPS should have found me. Peter can't figure out why Mr. Stark looks like he's in pain. Is Peter digging his fingers into his chest? He tries to pull his hands away, but Mr. Stark doesn't let go. I mean that they should have found you and then called me. Why would they do that? Because I was supposed to take care of you if anything happened to May. Peter has so many questions, like why and when, but they don't matter really. You don't have to do that. I signed the paperwork and I swore to your aunt I'd look after you, but here I am hiding out in the woods pretending to be dead when you needed me. It's too much. May never should have asked. Why had she asked? Why had Mr. Stark said yes? You don't have to take me in like some stray. You're not some stray, you're my son. I'm not your son, he says for the second time in one day, but then he thinks of Mrs. Stark's assumption, of Mr. Stark's wild past, and the tiniest spark of hope finds a crack in the walls he's tried to build around his heart. Am I? Mr. Stark's face falls, and Peter wants to melt into the floor and never solidify. What is wrong with him? This is why he's kept himself so busy, patrolling every available moment, working as many hours as he can, reading that damn GED study guide over and over, when it doesn't really matter if he passes the test, because a man who doesn't legally exist will never get a decent job or a college degree. He's tried so hard not to stop long enough to let himself wish that things were different, because unless he can accept that they're not, he will absolutely shatter. It's been 6 weeks and he's already failing. There's no way he can do this for 6 months, let alone 6 years. 60 years, no way. He's not going to survive this. I'm sorry, May. I tried. Oh God, I'm sorry. Of course I'm not. I'm sorry. I'm so pathetic. Don't say that about yourself. Please, Pete. I can't stand it. You're not pathetic. I'm not your son. Of course I'm not. God, I wish I were. I am pathetic. I don't deserve you. I don't. But I can't do this alone anymore. He's going to panic again. He can feel it building, and this time he won't fight it. It's too much. Too much. It's all too much. Maybe Tony will hold him as he dies, the way he held Aunt May. Can you look at me, kiddo? Please? But Peter can't. Then the hand holding to Mr. Stark's chest is gone, and he's clenching his eyes shut against the sudden cold. He drives everyone he cares for away. He should be used to this by now. But there's a gentle touch under his chin, raising his head, and he opens his eyes out of shock more than anything. There you are. Look, we don't share any DNA. I'm sadder about that than I ought to be. The Stark genes are full of generational trauma and proclivities for substance abuse. You don't need any of that, especially when you're smart enough on your own. But I wish I could claim you that way. That would be a bright spot on a dark time. But I can't. There's no Playboy-sized skeletons in your mother's closet. But in every other way that matters, you are my son. The son that I want. The one that I claimed. The one that I will fight and kill and die for. The one that I invented time travel to bring back to life. He can't. It doesn't compute. You invented time travel for me. You betcha. The only thing that would make me risk one kid was the chance to bring back another. But half of all life doesn't hold a candle to you. Mr. Stark reaches up to wipe one of Peter's tears away. He hadn't even realised he'd been crying. That's crazy. Doesn't make me a very good hero, I know, but I'd like to think it makes me a pretty good father. Though not the best father, clearly, or you would have known this already. I failed you over and over, and I'm so sorry. You didn't fail me. You literally admitted a few hours ago that you're starving yourself because you can't afford food, while my net worth is more than several third world countries. Not to mention that you just had a panic attack because you thought I was going to pawn you off to strangers. How is that not failing you? It's not your responsibility to look after me. You're not listening, kid. I need you to get this through your head, alright? It's not a burden to look after you. It's a privilege. Then Mr. Stark's hand is shifting until it cradles Peter's face, holding him steady so he can't do anything but look into his eyes, which are blazing. Look, I don't know how much of that letter you read, but I meant every heartbroken sentimental word. Losing you was agony. If not for Morgan, it might have destroyed me. But then she came along, and I realised I was mourning so hard because I loved you. Peter's breath hitches. He had read that, what seemed like ages ago. Had that really only been hours? But why would you love me? Mr. Stark freezes, and Peter wishes he hadn't derailed his train of thought, had just shut up and ignored his damned desperate curiosity, and let himself listen to the more impossible nice things. Never mind, that's an awkward question. Forget it. Nope, that's a valid question. You deserve the answer. I'm just trying to find the right words to do it justice. No need to freak out, okay? No need to panic. All good things here, I promise. Just give me a second here. Okay. His voice sounds so small in the silence between them. He waits, trying to figure out why Mr. Stark would be saying these things if they're not the truth. He isn't cruel, and if he wanted to hurt Peter, he wouldn't do it with sentiment. Even if he just wanted Peter to calm down, if he felt obligated to look out for him, this is an extremely strange way to do it. Finally, Mr. Stark seemed to rouse himself out of some kind of daze. His voice is small and quiet too. I'm an expert in a lot of fields, but love isn't one of them. My parents taught me that love had to be earned, and no matter how hard I tried, I could never figure out how to do that. So, fast forward through some mostly shitty decades. Along comes Morgan. She's extraordinary, brilliant and inventive and hilarious. Things that remind me how much I love her every time I see her. There's a look Mr. Stark gets when he talks about his daughter that Peter would never have thought him capable of back before Thanos. Like he shot Repulsor through all his walls, and his whole heart's on full display. Peter's glad he found a way to be that happy. He's also so jealous it hurts. But I didn't know any of that the day she was born. Pepper put her in my arms, and bam, I was gone. God, how I loved her. Still do, of course. Always will. But I realised, once I got over the buzz, that I'd felt that way before. The fingers on Peter's face tapped lightly against his cheek. It wasn't love at first sight with you, kid. I didn't know, that day in your apartment, how much you would mean to me. It grew, gradually, and honestly, those feelings scared me to death, so I tried not to dwell on them, refused to put a name to them, thought I was protecting us both by burying them. Clearly I was wrong. Clearly you needed to hear it even more than I needed to say it. I love you, Peter. I'm certain of that. But why? It would be easy to say that I love you because you can keep up with me in the lab, because you care so much about everyone and are literally the best person I've ever met. But that makes my love seem conditional, like I wouldn't love you if you weren't a genius and a hero. And that isn't true. It's not Spider-Man I love, it's Peter Parker. So all I can figure is that the universe made me to love you, that you're always meant to be my kid. Time halts and Peter freezes as the impossible words take root in his heart. Can you say something, Pete? I know that was a lot. You don't have to feel the same way, of course. Just maybe let me know so that I haven't ruined this, so I don't start panicking. Then Peter surges forward, colliding with Mr. Stark so hard they both almost fall, his arms wrapping tightly around his torso. Somehow Mr. Stark manages to twine an arm around Peter's back. The other hand, the flesh one, tangles into Peter's hair, cradling his head as he scratches gently at his scalp. The touch sizzles through him like electricity, leaving contentment in its wake, foreign and forgotten, and as sweet as May's chocolate chip cookies. "I love you too," Peter says, because of course he does. How could he not? Mr. Stark's whole body shakes with his barked laughter. "Phew. Great. Would have been awkward if you just thought of me as an aloof mentor figure. Could have called HR on me being a creep." Peter chuckles, too high and giggly, but he doesn't care. "That would have been a real mess." "Could you say it again, Rue?" Mr. Stark's voice is back to being super serious. It's only because of his super senses that Peter hears his desperate, "Please." "I love you, Mr. Stark." "Hey now." Mr. Stark pulls back and Peter whines, unwilling to help it. It makes the man smile. "I think we're past there, Bambino. If Morgan starts calling me Mr. Stark because she hears you calling me that, I'm gonna lose it. It's Tony now." Peter doesn't think he wants Morgan to start calling him Tony either, but he's not brave enough to mention that. Peter has always been deliberate in what he calls the hero. Mr. Stark conveys awe and respect and distance, and just a touch of sass. It's a suit of armour which protects Peter from getting too close, and wondering what it would be like if the man became more than a mentor who saw him as an occasionally helpful, superpowered obligation. Mr. Stark looks out for Spider-Man, because he doesn't want his death on his conscience. Again. Tony is someone who cares for Peter, in a way Peter's desperate for, in a way he's lost twice and will never have again. Tony is losing you as agony and soft Italian endearments. "I love you," and "Can you say it again, Rue, please?" and "You're not a stray, you're my son." Apparently Peter doesn't need that armour anymore. "I'll try." "That's all I ask." Tony reaches out and ruffles Peter's hair, and Peter gets another pleasant shock. "Scratch that. I also want you to stop apologising for things that aren't your fault, and putting yourself down. I don't like when people are hard on my favourite young adult." "Tony," he whines. "There we go. Great start. Always use my first name when you think I'm being ridiculous." Tony grins at him, and Peter smiles back, unused to this strange euphoria bubbling in his veins. "Just to be absolutely clear, you are my Spiderling, and there is no person or government entity that could pry you out of my arms. Got it?" Peter warms from the inside out. "I think maybe I'm starting to." "That's the spirit. Look, I'll never be May, and I don't want to replace her, but she did ask me to look after you, and even if she hadn't, I would have wanted to anyway. I know it probably surprises you, considering I was such a hot mess back when we hung out, but I've gotten pretty good at this whole parenting thing. 3 square meals a day, roof over your head, help with your homework, and a whole lot of love and positive affirmation. You're never going back to that shithole apartment again. Your home is right here. Or our penthouse in Manhattan, probably, because I imagine you'd want to go back to the city. We'll figure out the where, but the who isn't up for debate. You, me, Pep, and Morgan. We're a package deal now, a family. You're not alone anymore. You never will be again." Peter closes his eyes and just lets himself live in that for a second before he forges on and ruins it. "You don't even know how I ended up this way. I messed up." "It doesn't matter." Tony brushes the hair back from his face, then keeps his hand there, playing with his curls, which Peter doesn't have the energy or funds to try and tame anymore. "There's not a single thing you can possibly tell me that would change the way I feel about you, except maybe make me love you more." "I almost killed someone," he admits. If Tony's wrong, he'd rather know tonight than tomorrow. "Who hasn't in our line of work? I've actually done it. Haven't always regretted it either." "But..." "No buts. Not tonight, not ever. You can tell me all about it tomorrow and I'll figure out how to fix this whole memory loss, deleted identity thing. But you've got us, no matter what." Peter doesn't think even Tony can fix a magic spell meant to protect the multiverse. Certainly not in a day. But if there's anyone who could, it's him. He means to respond. Instead, a yawn catches him off guard, tearing through him like he's some kind of animal. "All right, Rip Van Winkle. That's clearly our cue that we've shared enough feelings for tonight. Let's get you to bed. Big day tomorrow." Tony pulls Peter into his side and steers him upstairs. "This was always supposed to be your room, you know," he says as they approach the spare bedroom Morgan had dragged them to earlier. I designed it for you. Full soundproofing, extra strength shades on the windows, the whole 9 yards. But I was dead, Peter says, regretting his casual phrasing when Tony stumbles and clutches him a little tighter. Sorry, but I didn't need a room. Tony twists and places a firm kiss right above Peter's eyebrow. Plans didn't seem right without a space for you, he says, still awfully close to Peter's forehead. There is a part of Peter that wants to collapse to the floor and cry, and another part that wants to run through the halls shrieking with excitement. He's so tired he does neither. He just follows Tony into the room, which looks like a store has been ransacked and a wrapping paper factory exploded. I did cry in that closet, Tony says, staring at the offending corner, which still has wrapped presents tumbling from it. Didn't know anyone but Friday knew that. He nudges a particularly large wrapped box with his foot. Better add this to our Boxing Day to-do list. There's still some real good ones you haven't opened yet. Peter can't fathom how there can still be more. This is already too much. Hey now, being extra is part of my charm, and this is 5 Christmases worth of presents. Just be glad I didn't get you a 10-foot stuffed Wookiee. Peter can't even imagine. Ned would die. You're making that up. That's not a thing. You want to bet? No way, that sounds awesome. Tony grins. I knew there was a reason we get along. Sadly, it didn't fit in your room, and Pepper vetoed keeping it down in the living room. Mrs. Stark was probably right, especially since Peter was probably dust at the time. But instead of admitting that, Peter says, You have to tell me how you got Harrison Ford to sign a box of Legos. Tony pulls Peter just a little tighter into his side. Now that's quite a story, young Padawan. Maybe we'll leave that for tomorrow too, in case we need a little levity. He releases Peter to pick through the present mountain, then hands him the one he was looking for. This should be pyjamas. We'll get you anything else you need tomorrow. Peter stares at the box covered in shiny red and blue stripes. This day has taken some bizarre turns. Why did you buy me pyjamas? Tony huffs out a laugh. Bought those after you came back to life, when I hoped you'd spend the holidays with us. There's this whole family Christmas jammies trend. We'll have to retake the photos. Morgan was pouting anyway. The thought of Mr. Stark taking family photos in matching pyjamas is so domestic. It wasn't that many years ago when Peter had to convince him he needed a tree. He'd acted like he was above common things such as traditions, although Peter had never doubted that he had a heart, no matter how well he kept it hidden. But it's strange to see that heart on full display. It's even stranger to think that Tony wants Peter to be part of those photos, that he planned this months ago, that he considers Peter family. Peter thought that he was done with family forever. He feels like he might float away. Is he dreaming, hallucinating, dying? Surely this isn't real. Good things don't happen to Peter Parker. Not anymore. But then Tony's hand is on his neck, grounding him, pushing him gently forward. Bathroom's in there. Should have everything you need. If you want me to tuck you in once you're ready, just have Friday call me. Peter twists around to look at him. Tuck me in? You know I'm not Morgan's age, right? Fine. If the young adult doesn't want a goodnight kiss, I'll just go to sleep now. I didn't say that. He's too old to be coddled. He knows this, but he wants Tony to come back. He's not ready to say goodnight and wake up from this wonderful dream. But his response came out too desperate, so he tries to compensate with sass, which he knows Mr. Stark appreciates. Will you read me a story too? Tony doesn't take the bait. I'll do anything you want, Bambino, he says, soft and serious. I'm not a baby. Peter crosses his arms over his chest because he signed an illegal lease and he does his own laundry, when he can find enough quarters, and shops for his own groceries. Not as often as he should. If he wasn't broke, he'd be an almost functional adult. Tony smirks, the softness replaced by a far more familiar expression. Sure, but you'll always be my spider baby. Tony! Tony's laughter is a wondrous sound, like a bell ringing as an angel gets its wings. I love it. I love you. Now get ready for bed. The shower is amazing. Peter hadn't been able to afford much hot water, or much water at all, so he'd make do with short, punishing showers that left him shivering for hours afterwards, even when he wore his coat to bed. After one particularly brutal patrol, he'd allowed himself to splurge, but the lukewarm water had turned icy cold after just 2 minutes. He knows the hot water here will never run out, and the Starks probably won't even look at their bills. Considering the astronomical amount of money Tony must have spent on all those presents, Peter can't bring himself to feel bad about this one indulgence. As he stands under the spray, the tension that's been coiled in his muscles for months melts. He breathes, and the air doesn't get caught in his chest. Instead of the cheapest bar of soap and a bottle of shampoo he could get at the bodega, this shower is stocked with luxurious liquids in flashy bottles with fancy names he doesn't recognise. When he lathers up his greasy hair, he realises he's going to smell like Tony. Today has been filled with such highs and lows. Now he's not entirely sure how he feels. Exhaustion has settled in the space between the extremes. He is used to quick assessments whenever he returns to his apartment. Which crisis is most critical? Where must he divert his limited funds, his limited energy, his limited ability to care? Is he bleeding so hard that he has to eat so his healing will do something? Or is a few dollars better spent on a new roll of bandages he'll just bleed through? Is he so cold he'll need to nudge up the thermostat up a degree? Or does he need to save for chemicals for the webs he's almost out of? Should he go out on patrol even though his leg might be infected and he's definitely lightheaded, because the alternative is convalescing alone in his apartment and facing the reality of his situation head on? But he closes his eyes and there's no crisis. He is fed and warm and safe and loved and known. Those last two the most wondrous of all. He's gotten good at handling pain that's just physical. It's the emotional stuff that still brings him to his knees. You won't believe the day I've had, May. He's gotten used to speaking to her aloud, even when he's not by her grave. It gives him someone to talk to that isn't JJ's assistant or a petty criminal. It started out pretty rough, but you sent me a guardian angel, just like I asked for. He sees Morgan barrelling at him out of nowhere in her ridiculous outfit, Mr. Stark hanging back but not turning him away. Morgan had saved him. He still doesn't understand how, by finding and dragging him out of the cold. But he'd still been lost until Tony had remembered, until Tony had told him so many wonderful things. You're my son, I love you, your home is right here, you're not alone anymore. 2 angels maybe, both much better than Clarence. He chuckles, and it shudders through him. Mr. Stark, Tony's going to look after me. Thanks for asking him to do that. I think I'm going to be all right now. I'm going to try. He opens his eyes, though he looks away from his sickly reflection in the gleaming shower wall. I love you, May. I'll come visit soon. He could have stayed under that spray for hours, but he doesn't want to keep Tony waiting. There will be other nights, other showers. The towel waiting for him is soft and heated. Peter didn't even know towel racks could do that. After he dries off, he wraps it around his waist and opens the box Tony handed him. Peter's used to cotton or flannel pyjamas. He thinks this soft and slightly slippery material must be silk. Ned's parents had made him and his sister wear matching Christmas pyjamas once. They'd been garish and hilarious, with a cartoon Santa and lots of reindeer. Theirs are nothing like that. The red and green plaid is elegant, something Mrs. Stark would wear. Peter stupidly wonders if the shining threads woven through are real gold. They feel amazing though on his dry and chapped skin, almost like a hug. The bed is huge and Peter barely has the forethought to pull the covers back before he collapses onto it. As soon as his back hits the mattress, he lets out a moan that he's glad no one's around to hear. Oh wow, maybe this is what it means to sleep on a cloud. There's so many pillows and they somehow offer just the right amount of support on his neck. He tugs the covers back over himself. He'd thought they might be silk too, but they're cotton, but so light and soft that they must be made from that fancy expensive cotton from Egypt, or something that rich people are always talking about. The bedding's all in familiar shades of red and blue that Peter knows they were chosen just for him. Friday, could you tell Mr. Stark I'm ready? Certainly, young boss. Peter isn't expecting that nickname, any more than he expects the pleasant voice to continue. I'm glad you've returned. Though it is hard to quantify it, Boss has not been the same in your absence. Oh golly, thanks. Peter's still reeling from that little revelation when Tony enters, no more than a minute or two since Friday summoned him. Tony halts in the doorway as his slightly elevated heartbeat slows. The realisation that he's wearing the matching pyjamas does something weird to Peter's heart as well. Well, don't you look clean and cosy? Then he's crossing the room and fussing with Peter's covers, actually tucking them under the mattress. Are you warm enough? I can bring you another blanket. Peter is so warm he thinks he might overheat during the night. No, this is good. Everything's good. You promise? Because you can ask for anything. Can you stay? It's out of his mouth before he can stop himself. Just until I fall asleep, I mean. Gosh, sorry, you don't have to. Pete, you just saved me from having to awkwardly ask if I could camp out here for a while. We're all good. I want to. Oh. It's going to take some time getting used to this easy affection. It might be easier once he gets some sleep. Now that he's laying down, his exhaustion's getting stronger, making his body heavy and his mind slow. Tony rolls the desk chair across the room and around the erupting present mountain until it's right beside the bed. This okay? Mm-hmm. Tony rubs at Peter's shoulder and then settles into the chair. Night, kiddo. I love you. Then he asks Friday to decrease the lights to 3%. Peter expects to fall asleep quickly, wrapped in comfort with the sound of Tony's distinctive heartbeat so near. But as soon as he closes his eyes, he worries what will happen once he opens them. What if this is just a dream? What if he wakes up back in his apartment, alone? Or what if he stays but Tony's memories disappear again? Maybe Doctor Strange will show up in his room complaining about a disturbance in the Force. Now that Peter's known again, will the multiverse start to crumble? I think I'll have to buy Morgan a pony now for remembering you. She'll name it Spidey and it'll be best friends with Gerald, and I'll have to find a place to board both of them in Manhattan. Peter snorts and rolls over on his side. Tony is leaned back in the chair, a foot propped up on the edge of Peter's bed. In the dim light, Peter can barely see him raise an eyebrow. What? You're not asleep? I can hear you thinking too hard all the way over here. Peter sighs and stretches out an arm in Tony's general direction. It's probably too dark for Tony to notice, but he does it anyway. Tony rolls a little closer and covers Peter's hand with his own. Your sister deserves whatever she wants after making me track you down, of course. But livestock management in the city is going to be a trial, is all I'm saying. Your sister. He has a sister now. He'd wanted a sibling when he was little, but when he hadn't had parents, he'd have settled for a cousin. But he never gotten one of those either. The darkness hides his tears, but his sniffling is loud in the quiet room. Oh, Rue. Suddenly Tony is perched on the edge of Peter's bed. One hand grips Peter even tighter. He raises the other to Peter's face and wipes away the tears with his silk Christmas pyjamas. And something inside Peter breaks. So many times today he's fought his tears, and except for the breakdown after the homeless guy invited him to feast, he mostly succeeded. Now they shudder through him in a full-body sob, his lungs spasming in awful harmony. But Tony is there, tugging Peter into his chest. Hey now, Tesoro, I've got you. I'm right here. You're not alone. I've got you. Not, don't cry, you're okay. But, I've got you. I'm here. One of Tony's hands rubs up and down Peter's back while the other strokes his hair, and Peter knows, even as he can't quite catch his breath, that he'll feel better once he's cried himself out, that he truly will be okay. When the tears finally stop, he feels so much lighter, even though his chest hurts and his head is filled with congestion. Sorry, he whispers. I don't even know why I was crying. I have several guesses, and I don't even know the whole story. Tony eases himself back and starts wiping Peter's tears away with his sleeve again, and then hands him a box of tissues from the bedside table. Sorry if that was weird. I promise I do know that you're not 6. I just can't turn off my dad instincts when I see one of my kids hurting. I don't remember what it's like to have a dad. Ben had been so good to him, kind and patient and loving. He taught Peter how to be a man, and never made him feel like a burden, even though he was. But Ben had made it very clear that he was Peter's uncle, not his father. He'd corrected Peter once, gently but firmly, and Peter had never made that mistake again. Peter had learned at 6 that parents were for other people. May and Ben loved him, and they'd take care of him, but he'd never have a mom or dad again. Peter can hear Tony's heart stutter. He can feel the silence between them shiver across his skin before Tony whispers, I can fix that, if you want. Tony will never replace Ben, or May, or Richard and Mary Parker. It's not like changing a worn-out tyre, tossing out the old for something new. What Tony and Peter have is entirely different, and it doesn't discount the others who'd raised him before. But Tony is the one left now, and Peter needs him desperately. He doesn't think any of the Parkers would mind. Please. It'd be my honour. Then they're embracing again, and words aren't strong enough to express the gratitude Peter feels. So he says what he thinks Tony needs to hear, far more than any thank you. I love you so much. Before tonight, Peter hasn't let himself think that, because what use is love that will never be reciprocated? But it's true. It's so true. It fills him now, every empty hollow that tears and misery left behind. Tony's voice, when he finds it, is thick with tears. Oh, Peter, you have no idea how much I love you. But after today, Peter thinks he does. Tony presses a lingering kiss to Peter's temple, then drops his forehead so they're pressed together, his hand cradling Peter's neck, just holding him there. Merry Christmas, Pete, he whispers. Welcome home. Thank you for listening. I hope you have a lovely day and happy holidays.